Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 8.2, the Cold War, from 1945 to 1980. Our first learning objective today is 8B, explain the continuities and changes in Cold War policies from 1945 to 1980. Now, before we begin, let's go through just a little bit of context. So, where we're picking up is at the end of World War II. Now, at the end of World War II, it was a turning point in U.S. history as we started to take an active role in world affairs. The United States became a leader in the United Nations as well as the creation of the World Bank. And for the first time, the U.S. joined an international organization to intervene in world affairs. We can see that organization here at the UN headquarters, which is actually located in New York City. Here's a couple of pictures I took from inside when the last time I visited, including the General Assembly and the Executive Council rooms. Now, the United States, since this point, has become involved heavily in UN peacekeeping missions around the world. You can see some of the different locations marked in blue that we were involved in between 1945 and 2009. In addition to this, the United States is going to occupy and help rebuild Japan after World War II. You can see some of our involvement in the Japanese homeland in these pictures here. In addition to this, the United States will also become involved in the Middle East as we help to create the Jewish nation in the Middle East by the founding of Israel. But for the most part, the Cold War is all about two sides. The United States, which represents capitalism, and the Soviet Union, which represented communism. Now, the United States and the Soviet Union were superpowers and rivals who dominated world politics between 1945 and 1980. This was an era of competing ideologies. The United States promoted democracy and capitalism, while the USSR tried to spread communism. The different ideologies between the US and USSR and their desire to spread these ideas led to an era of distrust, hostility, proxy wars, and near nuclear war on a few different occasions. Now, the end of World War II had increased tensions between the US and the USSR. Stalin, pictured on the far right, never trusted Britain or the United States during the war, and had complained often about the United States slow-footing our advances into mainland Europe. He thought that we were biding time to allow more Russians to die in the war. Now, the Manhattan Project had given the United States a monopoly on nuclear weapon technology and had made Stalin and the Soviets trust us even less. At the end of the war, the Yalta Conference, Stalin had agreed to allow what we call self-determination in Eastern Europe. That's these countries in this region right here. Now, what that meant was that these countries would be able to determine or have elections on what type of government they would have. However, Stalin had wanted a buffer zone between the USSR and the democratic nations in Western Europe. Now, the reason for this is that he had seen the Soviet Union throughout history continually be invaded, especially by the Germans and by the French. And so he wanted to create this buffer zone of countries that invading countries would have to go through before they actually hit Soviet soil in the future. Stalin would use his military to install communist governments in these Eastern European nations. As a result of this, Eastern European nations turned to communism, not because they wanted to, but they really didn't have a choice. And they became what were known as Soviet satellites, simply meaning that they would be controlled and revolve around the central power that was the USSR. In the years after World War II, the US began to view Stalin as a new type of Hitler, a dangerous dictator who wanted to take over and control the world. Therefore, by 1946, Europe was divided by a quote-unquote Iron Curtain that separated the democratic and capitalist countries of Western Europe from the communist and totalitarian countries of Eastern Europe. We can see that divide here and here. Now, the phrase Iron Curtain was first uttered by Winston Churchill from England, giving a speech in Kansas, of all places, and it was in many ways kind of symbolic of this divide between those two countries. Now, don't confuse the Iron Curtain, though, with the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall won't actually be created until later, and it actually is located in Berlin, which is actually located entirely within that Eastern Soviet zone. The Berlin Wall will only divide the city of Berlin between East and West. So there is a little bit sometimes of confusion between students. But that's where we begin with all this context, in that we're starting off in this Cold War, this era of hostility between the Soviet Union and between the United States, leading us to our first key idea, which says United States policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, seeking to do three major things: limit the growth of the communist military power and its ideological influence; two, create a free market global economy; and three, build an international security system. Now, we start to do this and we start to set up the framework for how we're going to accomplish these goals through a series of documents that we'll go through right now. So here's those goals once again, right? So the three major goals: limit the growth, create a free market economy, and build an international security system. Now, these three ideas are first introduced, oops, wrong way, there we go, first introduced in 1947 by a guy named George Kennan. And it's in the telegram that you see on the left-hand side where he introduces these ideas. Now, Kennan had been the ambassador to the USSR at this time and for the years during the Second World War. And what he gives is this what's called the Long Telegram, is the name of the document, because it was a telegram and it was like 54 pages. It was fairly long. And it outlines essentially the policy of containment. Now, this was this idea to limit the growth of the USSR, and this is going to guide our foreign policy during most of the Cold War. Now, a little bit later on, we're going to try and limit the military expansion of the communists with a document in 1950 produced by the National Security Council, simply entitled NSC 68. It was their 68th report. Now, what this did is this kind of remade the American military and intelligence communities to oppose communism. And it outlined a couple ways to try and contain military influence of the communists. For instance, the development of a new atomic bomb called the hydrogen bomb, several times more powerful. It also called for a conventional military buildup as well. Now, this leads us then to the ways in which we're going to accomplish those three goals, and that's key idea number two. So as post-war tensions dissolved the wartime alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union, the United States developed a foreign policy based on collective security, international aid, and economic institutions that bolstered non-communist nations. Now, this actually all kind of gets going before even the end of World War II. In 1944, what called the Bretton Woods Conference. Now, at this conference, leaders from around the world agreed to create global institutions, and these global institutions, which would be led by the United States, helped to dominate the post-war economy, and were intentionally designed by the United States to bolster non-communist nations. This included the creation of what was called the World Bank. Now, the idea behind this was to rebuild Europe and help to develop former colonies of the European powers after the war. The idea behind this is that in communist systems, communism thrives when you have countries that are economically unstable. Because one of the central tenets of communism is that the government will provide you with everything, and you will lack nothing. You will not lack jobs, food, housing. The basic necessities will all be taken care of. Now, in rich countries, this isn't really, very popular, because it also doesn't allow you to rise above your peers. And so in countries that are doing well, most people have those basic needs taken care of, and your next concern is trying to rise above others. But if you're in a poor country, in a developing country, in a country that is experiencing an economic downturn, then just the basics seem pretty good to you. And so by creating the World Bank and the other organization, the International Monetary Fund, which wanted to stabilize currencies and promote international trade, these two ideas would help to stabilize the economies of countries, therefore making them less likely to therefore become communist. Now, other things that we do to help prevent the spread of communism is when the USSR had begun to pressure the Greeks. and Turkey to turn communist. Both countries were facing economic crises within their home countries. The U.S. created what was called the Truman Doctrine, and this promised both economic and military aid to any nation threatened by communism, though it was specifically targeted at Greece and Turkey, located down here. Now, the Truman Doctrine worked, and neither country fell to communism. Now, easy way to remember the Truman Doctrine versus the next one I'm going to tell you. All right, Truman provided tanks. That's that military aid. All right, so they were facing that pressure from the Russians, and that's the basis for the U.S. aid to Turkey. And by the other way, we gave them a lot. Nearly $400 million in aid went to these two countries. In addition to this, European nations in Western Europe, that's this region right over here, they're also having difficulty recovering economically after World War II. And this led to a lot of fears of communism spreading into Eastern Europe. In addition to this, many countries, especially in France, had major union uprisings, large strikes, and there were large communist elements in places like Italy and France and Spain at this particular time. So to help fend this off, the U.S. is going to create what is called the Marshall Plan. And this offers $13 billion in aid to help rebuild post-war Europe, especially post-war Western Europe. Now, the Marshall Plan works. By 1952, Western Europe had recovered and communism never took root in Western Europe. Now, remember, to differentiate the two, Marshall's going to give money, where Truman is going to give tanks, military aid. All right, now he does give financial aid as well, but a lot of military aid is also given to those countries as well. Now, the following chart, you can see where a lot of that money is going to. We can see France, Italy, the United Kingdom is all getting a lot of that money. Here's the same kind of idea in the chart. You can see that our major allies like West Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain get a lot. Other countries further on down the list don't get quite as much. But it's still a lot of money. Those numbers are in millions of dollars. So Greece gets $500 million. That's a lot of money. Now, in 1948, the USSR used military force to turn Czechoslovakia to communism. This led to fears that Stalin would use similar tactics in Western Europe. Now, in response to this, in 1949, the United States is going to form what is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. Now, this is a military alliance among democratic countries in Europe and North America. And this was a military pact. You can see the different aligned countries under NATO in the blue, which were against the Soviet Union and what became known as the Warsaw Pact, or the communist bloc, in red. Now, NATO was not the only military alliance. It was just one of many military alliances the U.S. would form with other democratic nations over the course of the entire Cold War. Here's just a few of the other ones. Probably the most important over here is CETO. Now, CETO was the Southeast Asian Treaty. It included not only France, but also New Zealand, Australia, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, was in there as well. We also formed a military alliance with South American countries, with the Philippines, with South Korea, as well as the CENTO, which was the Central Treaty Organization between Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, the UK, the United States. But essentially what this did was this created a military network around the world of non-communist countries preventing the spread of communism. Now, do notice what I said there. Non-communist countries. This does not mean democratic countries necessarily. Several of the countries that are involved in this had dictatorships. They were just pro-us dictatorships. Then, in 1947, the U.S. government is going to also create 3 new governmental agencies to better deal and manage the challenges of the Cold War. The first of them is the Department of Defense. Now, this was a reorganization of the military branches. It used to be that each branch of the military was separately represented in the cabinet. And we also created an independent Air Force. It used to be that the Air Force was located not only under the Navy, but also under the Army. And this created a separate Air Force organization. Now, this became the preferred military agency of the Cold War, since we were going to need bombers and airplanes to drop nuclear bombs and missiles and things like that. In addition to this, we also created the Central Intelligence Agency, otherwise known as the CIA. This was created to spy on foreign nations, collect national security information, carry out covert operations, work with James Bond, etc. Now, the Cold War is going to escalate, as the threat of communism is going to spread to several places around the world, including the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And the CIA will become involved in those locations as we overthrow the governments of Iran and Guatemala. We intervene in Egypt, Bolivia, Chile, Cuba, all to stop the spread of communism. We'll talk about each of those events in more details during a later video. In addition to this, a third new agency that's created to better meet the challenges of the Cold War is the National Security Council. This was created to advise and assist the President on national security and foreign policy matters, leading us to key idea number 3. Concerned by expansionist communist ideology and Soviet repression, the United States sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including major military engagements in Korea. Now, at the end of World War II, Germany was divided into zones occupied by the US, Britain, France, and the USSR. Berlin, the German capital, was also divided, and it was located in the Soviet zone, as you can see from the map on the left. In 1948, Stalin tried to turn all of Berlin communist, and this became one of those confrontations between the US and USSR, and it ordered a Berlin blockade, which shut down all ground transportation to West Berlin. Now, West Berlin relied on everything to be shipped in to that city, and did for decades. Now, in response, the US was not going to be kowtowed by Stalin. And so we begin the Berlin airlift. For 11 months, US and British planes are going to supply the city with everything. In total, between 1948 and 1949, the Allies will have 278,000 flights, which will bring in 2.7 million tons of food and supplies. A plane will take off and land nearly every 3 minutes for 11 straight months. Now, by the end of the airlift, Stalin admitted defeat and lifted the blockade in 1949. The United States successfully kept West Berlin from turning communist. Therefore, between 1945 and 1949, the United States successfully contained communism in Europe. But in Asia, in 1949, communist forces led by Mao Zedong took control of China, and the Cold War spread to Asia. The fall of China was a shock to the USA, and President Harry Truman took the blame for losing China. The US response to the fall of China was to more aggressively confront confront communism in the world, especially in Asia. Now, the US was afraid of what was referred to as the domino theory, in which communist nations turned their neighbors communist. Now, as a result, the US vowed to contain the spread of communism anywhere in the world. And the US acted when communism threatened Korea. Now, in 1950, North Korea, using Soviet-supplied weapons, crossed what was called the 38th parallel and attacked South Korea. Now, up until this point, just if we can go back really quickly into World War II, Korea had been controlled by Japan during the war. Now, after the war, just like Germany, Korea had been partitioned, meaning that it had been divided in half. You can see that right up here, how Korea was divided between a North Korea, which would be controlled by the Soviet Union and turned communist, and a South Korea, which we aided and that became democratic. So when North Korea attacked South Korea, this was a major threat to the spread of communism around the world, and we had to stop this. And so, when South Korea appealed to the United States and to the United Nations, the United States sent troops to Korea to contain communism. And we almost failed. You can see that Northern forces were almost able to capture the entire continent. However, thanks to the incredible generalship of General Joseph MacArthur, as well as U.S. Air Forces, we were able to push the North Koreans back. However, we got a little too close to China. And when we had gotten too close to China, China entered the war and helped the North Koreans. Now, this precipitated an incredibly deadly struggle on the Korean Peninsula and some absolutely awful fighting. Now, after 3 years of the United States fighting both the North Koreans and the Chinese, a ceasefire was agreed to in 1953. The fighting stopped at the 38th parallel, and this was the restored boundary then between North and South Koreas. Now, technically, the war still continues to this day. However, the ceasefire is still in effect. We haven't shot at each other in nearly 70 years. However, technically, so to speak, the war is still going on. Now, the United States still has tens of thousands of U.S. military personnel along this border, and the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea, is the most heavily guarded border in the entire world, still to this day. Now, generally speaking, the United States had stopped communism from spreading into South Korea, and we showed that we were willing to fight a war to contain communism. Now, the U.S., though, at the same time in Asia, even though we had stopped it in South Korea, in 1954, Communist Ho Chi Minh is going to begin a war to gain independence for Vietnam. Now, we'll talk about that war in a later episode, leading us, finally, to key idea number 4. The Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct and indirect military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence or détente. Now, as I've already mentioned, the Cold War fluctuated in intensity as competition between the Soviet leaders and the United States leaders. Direct confrontation happened from time to time. Sometimes this direct confrontation was military in nature, sometimes it was not. For instance, the Berlin airlift was a version of direct confrontation without any shooting, and the Korean War, which cost nearly 45,000 Americans their lives, was certainly a direct confrontation. But it was also a series of indirect confrontations. For instance, an arms race and our policy of containment, the military aid that we provided both to Turkey and Greece. All of those were part of an indirect confrontation between our societies and our culture. Over this entire series of lectures in Period 8, pay attention to different events that serve as examples of both direct and indirect confrontation between our sides during this particular time. Now, there were some periods of détente, an easing of tensions and easing of peace. For instance, right after Stalin's death, there's going to be a period of détente. And during Nixon's administration, there'll be another one as well. Though we'll get into the details of that when we have a lecture on Richard Nixon. But generally, from 1945 to 1949, the U.S. was successful at containing communism in Europe. But over the next 40 years, the Cold War would intensify as communism spread in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Well, that fulfills our lecture for today. It's been a little bit of a longer one, and we've got a lot of information that's in there. But understand the reasons behind the Cold War, how the United States attempted to stop the spread of communism in its various ways, both in Europe as well as in Asia. Be able to also name our successes and failures there. Well, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button. Until next time, and as always, go Pack.